Jake Saunders had always loved his job as a pizza delivery driver. The flexible hours suited his college schedule, and the tips were usually decent. But lately, something about his small town of Haverbrook had begun to feel off. There were whispers of strange occurrences, and the usual quiet, friendly atmosphere seemed overshadowed by an eerie tension. One particularly dark and stormy night, Jake's manager handed him an order slip with a furrowed brow. "You sure you want to take this one, Jake? It's pretty far out, and the weather's nasty." Jake shrugged, forcing a grin. "What's the address?" 107, Willow Lane, his manager replied, glancing out the rain-spattered window. "It's way out by the old Kettering place. People say it's haunted." Jake laughed it off. "Haunted? Come on, Bob. You know I don't believe in that stuff. Just be careful, okay?" Bob handed over the pizza and a flashlight. "In case you need it." Jake nodded, grabbed the pizza, and headed out into the storm. As he drove through the rain, the streets became less familiar, the houses fewer and farther between. The flickering streetlights cast ghostly shadows, and the sound of the storm was almost deafening. Willow Lane was more of a narrow, winding path than a proper road. Trees arched overhead, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch him. Jake shivered despite himself and turned up the car's heater. Finally, the old Kettering place came into view, a massive, dilapidated mansion that looked like it had stepped out of a Gothic novel. Jake parked his car, the headlights illuminating the overgrown yard and the front steps leading to the grand, but decaying, front door. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed the pizza and his flashlight, and made his way to the entrance. The doorbell didn't work, so he knocked. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, making him jump. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with sunken eyes and a pallid complexion. "Good evening, ma'am." "I've got your pizza," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman smiled, but it was a cold, unsettling smile. "Come in, young man. It's dreadful out there." Jake hesitated but stepped inside. The house was dimly lit, filled with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. He followed the woman to a sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. A man sat in an armchair, his back to Jake. "Your pizza, sir," Jake said, hoping to make a quick exit. The man didn't respond. The woman handed Jake a $20 bill. "Keep the change, dear." "Thank you," Jake said, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he turned to leave, he noticed something odd. The man in the chair had been utterly still, unnaturally so. Curiosity got the better of him, and he glanced back. The figure hadn't moved an inch. "Excuse me, sir," Jake called out, but there was no response. The woman's cold smile widened. "He's not much of a talker, I'm afraid," she said. "Run along now, dear." Jake nodded, unnerved, and hurried out. As he drove away, the mansion disappeared into the darkness. He glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the woman's face watching him from an upstairs window, her smile twisted into something malevolent. That night, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He tossed and turned, haunted by nightmares of the mansion and its eerie occupants. The next morning, he decided to investigate. After his classes, he visited the local library and dug through old records and newspapers. What he found sent chills down his spine. The Kettering mansion had a dark history. The original owners, the Kettering family, had vanished without a trace decades ago. The house had passed through various owners, each one meeting a grim fate. The most recent owners were an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove, who had moved in years ago and were rarely seen in town. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Jake drove back to the mansion that evening. The storm had cleared, but the air was still thick with an unnatural stillness. He parked a little way from the house and approached on foot, using his flashlight to guide him. The front door was unlocked. Jake pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out, "Mr. and Mrs. Hargrove?" "It's Jake, the pizza delivery guy." Silence. The house seemed even more oppressive than before, the shadows darker, the air colder. He made his way to the sitting room, but it was empty. The fire had long since died out, and the room was freezing. As he explored, he stumbled upon a door to the basement. He hesitated, but curiosity won out. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. With a deep breath, Jake switched on his flashlight and started down. The basement was a nightmare. Old, rotting furniture lay scattered about, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. But what caught Jake's attention was the far corner of the room. There, slumped in a chair, was the man from the night before. His skin was ashen, his eyes lifeless. Jake's heart pounded. He turned to flee, but something cold and strong grabbed his arm. He spun around to see Mrs. Hargrove, her face twisted in a ghastly smile. "You're not leaving," she hissed. Jake struggled, but her grip was iron. She dragged him deeper into the basement, toward an old, rusted door. She flung it open, revealing a small, windowless room. Inside, Jake saw more bodies, each in various stages of decomposition. "No one leaves," Mrs. Hargrove whispered, shoving him into the room. The door slammed shut, and Jake was plunged into darkness. Panic set in. Jake pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the walls were thick, and no one would hear him. Hours passed, maybe days. Hunger and thirst gnawed at him, and the air grew stale. Just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the dim light from the basement. It was Mr. Hargrove. "We need a new delivery boy," he said, his voice a guttural growl. Jake was dragged from the room, too weak to fight. They brought him upstairs, where the house seemed even more alive with malevolent energy. The Hargroves forced him into a chair and bound him with ropes. "You'll deliver for us now," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice dripping with malice. "And you'll bring us more guests." Jake's mind raced. He had to escape, had to warn others. But for now, he was trapped, at the mercy of the twisted couple and their haunted mansion. Weeks passed in a blur of horror. The Hargroves used Jake to lure more victims to the house, each delivery a death sentence. He watched helplessly as innocent people fell into the same trap, their fates sealed by the malevolent spirits that seemed to control the mansion. But Jake hadn't given up hope. He had learned the routines, the weaknesses. One stormy night, when the Hargroves were distracted, he managed to slip his bonds. He crept through the house, avoiding the creaking floorboards, and made his way to the front door. Freedom was just a few steps away when a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He turned to see Mrs. Hargrove, her eyes burning with fury. "You're not leaving," she hissed. With a surge of adrenaline, Jake broke free and bolted out the door. He sprinted to his car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the driveway, glancing back to see the Hargroves watching him from the porch, their faces twisted with rage. Jake didn't stop driving until he reached the police station. He burst inside, breathless and shaking, and told his story. At first, they were skeptical, but the fear in his eyes convinced them to investigate. A team of officers accompanied Jake back to the mansion. The storm had cleared, and the house looked almost peaceful in the morning light. But as they approached, the air grew cold, and an oppressive silence fell over them. The Hargroves were nowhere to be found, but the basement revealed the grim truth. The bodies were there, evidence of the horrors that had taken place. The police conducted a thorough search, but the Hargroves had vanished, leaving no trace. Jake never returned to Haverbrook. He moved to a new town, started a new life, but the nightmares followed him. The haunted mansion, the twisted couple, and the faces of the victims haunted his dreams. He often wondered what had become of the Hargroves. Were they still out there, luring unsuspecting victims to their doom? Or had the spirits of the mansion finally claimed them? Jake would never know. But he had escaped, and that was enough. He had survived the final delivery. For more horror stories, please subscribe to this channel.